Thanks very much. So my recollection of general election night was a PhD student, and I'd got these commitments from all these women candidates. They'd speak to me after the election, and I moved the television into my bedroom. I had a Muji notebook and purple Muji pens because it was kind of fashionable at the time. Still fashionable, I suppose. And I was ticking them off as they kept winning. And then there was this moment when I realized I could just stop flicking between pages and numbers and telephone numbers because they were just all going to win. And so I think 1997 has to be remembered as the election when the number of women doubled overnight from 60 to 120, of whom 101 were Labour women MPs. And you just can't keep saying that enough, whatever your audience, if you like. But in responding today, I feel that I have to contextualize what I'm going to say in the context of last week's politics, gender politics in the last few years, gender politics, to remind ourselves that, a bit like you were saying before, the idea of inevitability, the idea that gender politics will always get better has to be queried because it's not the case. Parliament and politics and parties remain male-dominated and masculinized. There is this thing called gender power that needs to be negotiated. There is a gender backlash in a context of populist and authoritarian politics and culture wars, and that women in politics must as ever mobilize and act to regender and feminize politics. But back to 97. So in preparing for today, I went back and read the pioneering feminist political scientist Johnny Lowandowski's report of that election in Parliamentary Affairs, which she entitled Gender Politics, a Breakthrough for Women, ? I think we can remove the question mark, notwithstanding the qualifications I've just given you about the last few weeks and the continuing environment. This was a watershed election for the descriptive representation of women, the number of women who sit in our parliament. But it did not, nor should we have expected Labour women or a Labour government to have ended women's poverty of representation. And that's a term I'm increasingly using to really capture the various dimensions. It's not just about counting women's bodies in our parliaments, although we have to keep doing that because we're not at parity. But we need to think about substantive representation, what is done for women, symbolic and also effective representation. How do women feel about politics? How connected are they to our institutions? So it's best to think about representation as a mélange and study it appropriately. So Johnny's analysis suggests that there was indeed a transformation, of which I would not disagree, the arrival of all these new Labour women MPs. But of course that was a result, again picking up a theme here, of the previous or the prior transformation of the party and party organisation, party rules and party culture. So 97 wasn't when it started. We need to remind, or I need to remind, I want to remind you of the importance of a women's shortlist. Caroline's mentioned it, but again, we shouldn't assume that numbers always go up. They don't, and that mechanisms matter, party rules matter. We don't, of course, have legislative quotas in this country. Other parties have resisted, and resisted for a long time, the importance of such rules. The merit argument has not been one that we've managed to overturn. But if we think about 97 compared to today, recently a clerk told me that if you are in Parliament and an MP, someone says to you, a Labour MP is coming to see you. Today that's going to be a woman because the Parliamentary Labour Party is more than 50% female. And that's worth celebrating. And we have to link that back to 1997, where in those days, Parliament as a whole was now made up of 18.2% of all MPs and a quarter of the Labour Party. Only 13 Conservative women were returned at that election. The Conservative Party has been playing the politics of catch-up since. It had a moment of doing a little bit better, but perhaps provocatively it's going backwards. When we think about that election, women's issues were marginal to all party manifestos. But again, I think we need to emphasize the transformation in terms of issues and the machinery of government. So whilst Labour didn't introduce a ministry of women, we had a women's minister, and of course this panel includes. But of course we had to recognise they didn't always get paid, and they were afterthoughts, and all of those kind of questions remain. Labour's offering to women was in part a reflection of needing to win women's votes, which Tim mentioned, and of course the historic gap that previously had been in the Conservative Party's favour, and that gender gap in Labour's favour was not secured until, if you like, this election. So it wasn't a transition moment in terms of voting. I'm going to close with a few prompts. Counting women remains critical. I've said that. There's a complacency that just says more women will happen if you just let parties do what they want to do. I don't think that's true. The evidence, the global evidence about quotas is unambiguous, but politicians don't like policy-based, evidence-based policy unless it supports what they want to do. It's much more, gender politics is much more about getting women in. It's about changing, transforming, regendering, feminizing, feministizing, ugly word, but nonetheless something that's worth distinguishing between feminizing. Women's political presence begs questions of making a difference in policy and institutional terms. We need to ask what kind of difference, which women, so by and for which women. The relationship between getting women in and changing politics is much more complicated than we can sometimes get seduced by with ideas of just getting enough in. Don't confuse women's bodies with feminist minds, nor use sex gaps in behavior as the only measure of transformation, because if we were changing politics, then men would be changing their behavior and we wouldn't see a gap between the behavior of men and women. We must always think about party ideology, and that these women politicians enter political institutions not of their own making, and that constrains them. Their agency is not theirs of their own. I want to also talk momentarily about violence against women in politics. This is a belated recognition in established democracies. I wonder if we went back and looked at the hostility around all women shortlists, we would be now calling what happened violence against women in politics in this country. Important never to forget Jo Cox. Gendered medium representation, have we progressed there? Okay, we can leave that to discussion. The norms of the good politician and the candidate. I'm just going to pick up on what you said about taking time off. I actually think we do need to talk about work-life balance and candidates, and maybe if you are doing events on a Saturday, we might need to reclaim some time for people who have caring responsibilities. But anyway, we can talk about that maybe over tea. I'm getting to like 4 points now. Masculinized political institutions. We have got to redesign and rebuild our political institutions to make sure that we don't try and make women fit our politics, but that our institutions fit people who do not fulfill that male politician norm and somehow work differently. Feminist gender knowledge and gender expertise needs to be the heart of any government, and I would suggest for this audience, any incoming Labour government. Over the last 25 years in British politics, much of the change, much of the leadership on gender politics has been led by Labour women MPs, and I think we should hold on and celebrate that. Thank you.